And always there is usually a blonde who is a kind of sex symbol of the country, of the industry for a time, and then she moves out and somebody else moves in.
That some of these men who've been called out, because I went through it in my generation of men, and I know how predatory they were. Horrible.
The 1970s in Britain were a decade of genuine cultural upheaval. The post-war consensus about how people should live, who they should marry, how long they should stay married, what they were permitted to want, was under pressure from every direction. The women who occupied the center of British entertainment life during that decade existed at the precise intersection of the old world and the new one, and many of them navigated that intersection in ways that the tabloid press documented obsessively and the public consumed voraciously. What follows is not a moral inventory. It is a factual account of 10 women, actresses, musicians, writers, and performers, whose romantic lives in the 1970s generated headlines, changed careers, produced genuine tragedy in some cases, and in others demonstrated a degree of personal autonomy that the era made genuinely remarkable. Their names are documented, their relationships are documented. Their outcomes in several cases are deeply sobering. This is their record. 1. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was, by the time the 1970s began, already a figure of considerable cultural history. She had been positioned by the British film industry in the 1950s as a domestic answer to the American blonde bombshell, a deliberate commercial construction that she inhabited with sufficient intelligence and genuine talent to transcend its limitations. By her own effort, she became something more lasting than a marketing concept. She became a genuine personality, one of the most recognizable women in the United Kingdom, whose appeal rested on a combination of physical charisma, a sharp comic timing, and an absolute refusal to pretend to be more demure than she was. By the 1970s, she had moved through significant professional and personal transitions. Her home, a large property near Ascot, had become one of the most talked-about social venues in the country. The gatherings she hosted during this decade were documented by those who attended them as events without obvious precedent in British entertainment circles. Guests ranged, by contemporary accounts, from individuals connected to organized crime through to sitting politicians and international entertainment figures. The atmosphere at these events and the freedom of conduct that characterized them was widely discussed in London social circles throughout the decade. Diana made no sustained effort to conceal the nature of her personal life. She was forthright in the period about her belief in romantic freedom and in her refusal to conduct herself according to the expectations applied to women in public life. She wrote memoirs during this decade that named individuals and described her romantic history with a directness that was, for a woman of her profile in that era, commercially brave. The book sold. Her marriage to the actor Alan Lake, they had married in 1968, was the central personal relationship of her 1970s. The marriage was, by the accounts of both parties and those around them, conducted on terms that were unconventional by the standards of the time. Both partners were aware of and accepting of the other's outside connections. Sustaining the relationship under those terms was, by the accounts of those who knew them, more complicated in practice than the philosophy suggested in theory. The vulnerability beneath the public persona was noted by those who knew her well. The men she chose during this period were, by the assessment of people in her circle, often volatile individuals. Her pursuit of romantic intensity and her genuine fear of solitude drove choices that were not always in her practical interest. She had spent her professional life performing confidence. The reality was more complicated. Diana Dors died in May 1984 from ovarian cancer. She was 52. Alan Lake died by suicide in October of the same year, 5 months after her death. The record of their decade together is one of the most fully documented and genuinely complex in British entertainment history. 2. Joan Collins. Joan Collins entered the 1970s as a woman who had already made 2 significant marriages and ended both of them. She had been working professionally since the early 1950s, and by the point the new decade began, her understanding of how the entertainment industry operated and of her own position within it was thorough and unsentimental. Her marriage to the American businessman Ron Cass in 1972 was her 3rd. It did not significantly reduce the level of public attention paid to her romantic activities. Throughout the decade, she remained one of the most discussed women in the British tabloid press, and the discussion was overwhelmingly focused on her approach to relationships, which was characterized by the press, and to some extent by Collins herself, as strategic, self-determined, and largely indifferent to the conventional expectation that women of her profile should prioritize long-term stability over personal satisfaction. Her philosophy, as she articulated it during this period, was direct. She saw no compelling reason why the freedoms that male performers in her industry had always exercised without significant comment should not be equally available to her. She was not interested in preserving a wholesome public image at the cost of her actual preferences. She was, by her own account, bored easily. She found the early stages of romantic interest more compelling than the later stages of established relationships. She did not regard these as character flaws requiring correction. The Collins family dynamic provided an additional layer of public interest during this decade. Her younger sister Jackie was, by the mid-1970s, an established best-selling author. Jackie Collins' novels, The Stud was published in 1969, The Bitch followed in 1979, drew on a world of sexual politics, power, and ambition that bore significant resemblance to the social environment her sister inhabited. The suggestion, widely circulated at the time and since, was that Joan's life provided direct material for Jackie's fiction. The film adaptations of those novels in the late 1970s, Joan starred in both The Stud in 1978 and The Bitch in 1979, brought this connection into explicit public focus. The roles she played were women who exercised sexual and social power in a world dominated by men. The line between character and performer was sufficiently blurred that the films functioned, in the public consciousness, as a form of autobiographical statement. So Joan Collins is, at the time of this writing, still alive and still working. She is one of the very few figures from this period who has navigated the decades since with her reputation and her career not merely intact, but enhanced. Her 1970s set the terms of a public persona that proved extraordinarily durable. 3. Sarah Miles. Sarah Miles was the daughter of a wealthy engineer, educated in ways that gave her access to the establishment world and a thorough understanding of exactly which of its rules she intended to ignore. She had made her professional reputation in the 1960s, and by the time the 1970s arrived, she was one of the more recognizable British actresses in international film, largely through her work with director David Lean and through films that gave her considerable visibility in the American market. On her marriage to the screenwriter Robert Bolt, who wrote the screenplays for Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, and A Man for All Seasons, among others, was one of the most prominent partnerships in British creative life. It was not a conventional partnership. Miles was explicit in interviews during this period about her belief that monogamy was not a requirement she intended to impose on herself. She described her philosophy as that of a free spirit requiring variety. She integrated some of her outside relationships into her domestic life with Bolt in ways that the press found extraordinary and the public found either fascinating or appalling, depending on their position. The decade's most significant episode was not of her design. In 1973, during the production of The Man Who Loved Cat Dancing, filmed in Arizona, she, with Burt Reynolds as her co-star, Sarah Miles's business manager and personal associate, David Whiting, was found dead in her motel room. Whiting was 26 years old. The circumstances of his death triggered a police investigation and a media response that was, by the standards of 1973, massive. Miles was questioned extensively. The investigation ultimately returned a verdict of accidental death. No charges were brought against anyone. The press coverage during and after the investigation was severe. Miles was portrayed in sections of the media as a dangerous figure, a woman whose personal conduct had produced lethal consequences. She contested this characterization consistently and without apparent damage to her fundamental sense of self. She continued working. She continued conducting her personal life on her own terms. Her relationship with Bolt persisted, fractured, and eventually reconstituted itself in a form that no one who had watched the 1970s from the outside would have predicted. When Bolt suffered a serious stroke, Miles returned to him and subsequently remarried him, caring for him until his death in 1995. Their history across that entire arc is one of the stranger and more genuinely complicated in British entertainment of the period. 4. Britt Ekland. Britt Ekland was Swedish by birth, but by the early 1970s she had established herself as a fixed feature of the British entertainment landscape with sufficient permanence that her nationality was rarely the first thing people mentioned. She had appeared as a Bond girl in The Man with the Golden Gun in 1974, and her personal associations had kept her in consistent public attention throughout the decade. The relationship that defined her 1970s was with Rod Stewart. They began their relationship in 1975, and for the period of its duration, it was the most discussed romantic pairing in British popular music. Stewart was, at that point, at the peak of his commercial success. His records were reaching the top of charts on both sides of the Atlantic. The combination of his profile and hers produced a tabloid presence that was essentially unavoidable. What the accounts of those who observed this relationship from close quarters describe is something more complicated than the glamorous surface suggested. Ekland was, during this period, substantially involved in the organizational and creative infrastructure of Stewart's professional life. She contributed specifically and documentably to the recording of Tonight's the Night, the 1976 track that reached #1 in both the UK and the US. She provided the French-language spoken vocals on the record. She was involved in the styling and presentation decisions that significantly shaped his public image during this period. The relationship ended, by her own account, with abruptness and with consequences for her practical situation that were significant. She has spoken directly in subsequent years about the terms on which it concluded. Before Stewart, Ekland had been in a significant relationship with the record producer Lou Adler. Before Adler, she had been married to Peter Sellers from 1964 to 1968, a marriage that had concluded under considerable strain and that had been publicly turbulent. Her account of the pattern across these relationships and her admission, made in later years, that she felt invisible without a man to provide a form of external validation, gives a different texture to the public image of a woman who appeared to the outside world to be in complete command of her situation. 5. Barbara Windsor. Barbara Windsor's public image in the 1970s was one of the most precisely engineered in British popular culture. The character she projected, bubbly, cheerful, innocent, in a way that her physical appearance gently contradicted, was the product of considerable professional skill and was received by the British public with genuine and lasting affection. Her Carry-On films were among the highest-grossing British productions of their era, and her presence in them was a significant component of their commercial appeal. The private life behind that image was substantially different from the projection. Windsor's romantic entanglement with her Carry-On co-star Sid James has been documented in her own published autobiography and in accounts from others connected to the franchise. James was, during the production years of the early 1970s, married. He was significantly older than Windsor. His pursuit of her was, by her own account, persistent and emotionally pressuring in ways that she found difficult to manage given the professional structure within which they both operated. He used his position as the leading male figure in the franchise as an implicit pressure in the relationship. Windsor describes his devotion as overwhelming rather than flattering, and her own management of it, engagement followed by withdrawal, as reflecting genuine discomfort with the intensity he brought to it rather than calculated cruelty. The more consequential relationship of her 1970s was her marriage to Ronnie Knight. Knight was a man with documented connections to criminal networks in London. Windsor has acknowledged in her memoir that she was aware of the nature of those connections and that she found the associated lifestyle more exciting than frightening. The marriage, they had wed in 1964, ran through the 1970s against a background of police investigations, legal proceedings, and the kind of public scrutiny that the combination of her fame and his associations made inevitable. Knight was subsequently implicated in the Security Express robbery of 1983. At the time of its commission, he armed the largest cash robbery in British history, yielding approximately £6 million. He fled to Spain to avoid prosecution and remained there for a number of years. Windsor's navigation of the public consequences of her connection to him, while simultaneously maintaining the wholesome entertainment persona that her television audience expected, was a remarkable piece of compartmentalization that the decade made necessary. 6. Charlotte Rampling. Charlotte Rampling's father was a British Army officer who later served in a NATO command capacity. Her background was therefore about as far from the bohemian as the British class system could produce. The distance she traveled from that background, in terms of the choices she made during the 1970s, is one of the more striking journeys in British cultural life of the period. Rampling had established herself as a serious screen presence by the early part of the decade. Her work in Luchino Visconti's The Damned in 1969 and subsequently in Liliana Cavani's The Night Porter in 1974 placed her in a category of actress willing to engage with material that most of her contemporaries would not touch. The Night Porter, in which she played a concentration camp survivor who re-encounters her captor years after the war, was controversial in ways that went well beyond the merely provocative. It required Rampling to inhabit a psychological landscape of extraordinary complexity, and she did so with a commitment that film historians have continued to assess seriously in the decades since. Her personal life during the 1970s was the subject of considerable press interest for reasons that had nothing to do with her films. And in 1972, Rampling was living in what was described at the time, and has been described in accounts since, as a domestic arrangement involving herself, her husband Brian Southcombe, a publicist, and a male model named Randall Lawrence. The three shared a household. When questioned about the arrangement by the press, Rampling was direct. She described the situation as one without jealousy and stated her position that romantic attachment should not be confined to a single partner. The tabloid response to this was, in 1972, substantially agitated. The arrangement did not become a permanent structure. By 1976, Rampling had relocated to France, drawn by her relationship with the French composer and musician Jean-Michel Jarre. She left her previous life in London, including her marriage to Southcombe, and built a new one in Paris. Her marriage to Jarre lasted until 1997. The transition demonstrated the pattern that characterized her decade: total commitment to whatever her current situation demanded, followed by clean departure when that situation no longer suited her development. 7. Marianne Faithfull. Marianne Faithfull's background was, on paper, one of the most rarefied in the British entertainment world. Her mother was an Austrian baroness with a lineage that included the psychoanalyst Freud in its extended family tree. Her father was a British academic. She was educated at a convent school. The journey from that starting point to her position at the center of the 1960s rock world, and then through the chaotic middle years of the 1970s, is one of the more thoroughly documented trajectories in British cultural history. Her relationship with Mick Jagger, which had run from 1966 and ended in 1970, was among the most publicly discussed in British popular music. By the time the 1970s began, that relationship was over, and Faithfull's personal situation had deteriorated significantly. Her involvement with heroin during this period was documented in the press and has been discussed by Faithfull herself at considerable length in subsequent interviews and in her 1994 autobiography. The combination of her addiction and the loss of the professional momentum she had built in the late 1960s produced circumstances that were, by her own account, genuinely desperate. She spent a period of the early 1970s homeless in London, living in the Soho area. This is documented in accounts from people who encountered her during this period and in her own recollections. "I'm the figure who had been photographed at the center of the most famous social circle in British popular music, was, for a period, without stable housing." The relationships she moved through during the decade were conducted against this backdrop. She was involved with Patrick Rossmore, an Irish aristocrat. She was involved with Ben Brierley, the guitarist with the punk band The Vibrators, whom she married in 1979. Each of these relationships provided, in her own framing, a form of temporary structure in circumstances that were otherwise unstable. The end of the decade produced the most important creative work of her career. Broken English, released in 1979, was a record that emerged from the specific damage of the decade she had just survived. It was critically assessed as a major artistic achievement and remains the work most consistently cited when her career is evaluated. The voice on that record, roughened by the years preceding it in ways that her earlier recordings did not anticipate, carried an authority that could only have come from what the decade had done to her. 8. Fiona Richmond. Fiona Richmond occupied a category that had limited precedent in British entertainment. She was not primarily a film actress in the conventional sense, nor a television personality, nor a recording artist. She was, in the most direct description, the most prominent sexual performer of the 1970s British permissive culture. A woman who made her career from the explicit celebration of sexual freedom at a moment when Britain was working out, in public, and in its courts. Exactly what the limits of that freedom were. Her work in the stage production Let My People Come, which ran in London from 1974 and was one of the most discussed theatrical productions of the decade, and her long association with Men Only magazine, where she was a regular feature and contributing writer, placed her at the center of debates about obscenity, freedom of expression, and women's sexual autonomy that occupied British cultural and legal institutions throughout the decade. Her most significant personal relationship was with Paul Raymond, the theater and property entrepreneur whose control of substantial portions of Soho's commercial real estate and entertainment venues made him, by some calculations, the wealthiest man in Britain by the end of the decade. Their relationship was a partnership in multiple senses: professional, financial, and personal. Richmond was a central figure in the social world that Raymond's empire generated, and she occupied that position with a visible enjoyment of its privileges. Within that relationship and outside it, Richmond maintained a personal independence that was, for the era, deliberate and documented. She engaged in relationships beyond her primary partnership openly and without apparent ambiguity about her intentions. She drove fast cars, traveled extensively, and wrote about her experiences with the frankness that characterized everything she did professionally. Her public position was consistent. She was the agent of her own desires, not the object of anyone else's. What distinguished Richmond from many of her contemporaries was the absence of the apologetic register that the press expected from women whose conduct attracted tabloid attention. She did not present herself as damaged or as a victim of the times. She presented herself as someone who had made choices and was satisfied with them. Whether or not that presentation fully captured her interior experience, its consistency across the decade is notable. 9. Jackie Collins. Jackie Collins was 4 years younger than her sister Joan, and the two women's careers ran in parallel in ways that generated continuous public commentary throughout the 1970s. Where Joan's medium was the screen, Jackie's was the page, and the page proved, over the long arc of both their careers, to be the more durable instrument. Our Collins had published The World is Full of Married Men in 1968, and The Stud, which would be adapted for the film starring her sister in 1978, in 1969. By the time the 1970s were fully established, she was a known figure in the London and Los Angeles social scenes that her books depicted, and the question of how directly her fiction was drawn from her personal observations of those scenes was one that critics and journalists raised consistently. Her marriage to Oscar Lerman, an entrepreneur and nightclub owner, was the stable personal structure around which her professional and social activities during this decade were organized. Lerman operated Tramp, one of the most prominent and consistently fashionable London nightclubs of the 1970s. Marianne Collins's access to the world the club contained was both a source of personal enjoyment and of direct material for her work. Collins was explicit in interviews during this period about her method. She observed the people around her, their ambitions, their vulnerabilities, the specific textures of how power and desire operated in the world she moved through. And she wrote what she saw, with the names changed and the details adjusted. She moved through the social landscape of the decade with the dual consciousness of a participant and a chronicler, and the men she encountered in the context of that movement served both functions simultaneously. Her output during the decade was substantial. Lovers and Gamblers was published in 1977. By the end of the 1970s, she had established a commercial formula: sexually frank, are politically aware in the specific way that involves understanding how hierarchies actually function rather than how they present themselves. That would make her one of the best-selling novelists in history. Over the course of her career, she sold more than 500 million books in 40 countries. Jackie Collins died in September 2015 from breast cancer at the age of 77. She had kept her diagnosis private for 6 years and continued working throughout her illness. The discipline with which she managed the information about her condition until shortly before her death was characteristic of a woman who had spent her career controlling her own narrative. 10. Vivien Merchant. Vivien Merchant's position in the hierarchy of British stage acting in the 1970s was not in question. She was a Royal Shakespeare Company veteran and an Academy Award-nominated film actress for her performance in Alfie in 1966, and, perhaps most significantly in terms of how the theatrical world assessed her, the primary interpretive intelligence behind the early production of her husband Harold Pinter's plays. She had created roles in his work that no one else had originated, and her understanding of Pinter's dramatic language was, by the assessment of those who worked with her, unmatched. Her marriage to Pinter had been the central structural fact of her professional and personal life since they had wed in 1956. It was a marriage of creative as well as personal significance, and the 20 years of it that preceded its collapse represented, for Merchant, not just a romantic partnership, but the entire framework within which her identity as a working artist had developed. The collapse came in 1975. Pinter had begun a relationship with the historian and biographer Lady Antonia Fraser, a woman of considerable public profile in her own right, the author of major biographies of Mary Queen of Scots and Oliver Cromwell. His affair with Fraser was not conducted in a manner designed to minimize public exposure. When the marriage to Merchant ended as a consequence, it ended in full public view, and the coverage in the British press was substantial and, toward Merchant, not always sympathetic. What followed for Merchant across the remainder of the decade was a deterioration that was documented by those around her as both professional and personal. She moved through a series of relationships in the years after the separation, none of which provided the stability or the creative grounding that her marriage had offered. The accounts of those who knew her during this period describe a woman who had built her identity so thoroughly around her marriage, around Pinter, around the work they had made together, around the social and intellectual world that marriage had given her access to, that its removal left her without an adequate internal structure. Her drinking became severe. The professional engagements that came her way in the late 1970s were of a different quality from the work she had done before. She was, by the accounts of people who had known her at her professional peak, a genuinely different person from the woman who had inhabited those RSC stages. Vivien Merchant died in October 1982 at the age of 53, from complications arising from her alcoholism. Her death came 2 years after she had officially divorced Pinter, and 7 years after the marriage had in practice ended. She had been, by any serious assessment, one of the finest stage actresses working in Britain in the period when her career was intact. The decade that followed the end of her marriage consumed that career and ultimately her life. She remains a figure of genuine tragedy in the record of British theatre, not because of the romantic tumult, which was in its essentials a story shared by many people, but because of the specific cost that tumult extracted from a talent that had no obvious replacement. 10 women. 10 documented histories spanning a decade that was, in Britain, genuinely transitional in terms of what women were permitted to want and to claim in public. The variety of those histories is striking on its own terms. Diana Dors and Fiona Richmond inhabited their freedoms with apparent relish and relative immunity from the worst consequences. Marianne Faithfull survived conditions that would have ended many people entirely and produced her best work at the decade's conclusion. Vivien Merchant did not survive the conditions she faced, and the record of her last years is one of the more sobering in British entertainment. What the decade made clear in the lives of these 10 women and in the lives of many others, not included here, is that the liberation on offer in the 1970s came with variable terms. It was available to some women in ways that allowed them to build on it. For others, the combination of public exposure, professional vulnerability, and the specific emotional costs of lives lived at intensity and in full public view produced outcomes that no philosophy of romantic freedom was equipped to manage. The record is what it is. These are the documented facts of 10 lives, lived in full view of a British public that was simultaneously fascinated, appalled, entertained, and in certain cases, insufficiently concerned about the women it was watching.